This evening, we'd like to discuss a very special tribe, of course, the Levites. And not just the Levites, but as already indicated in the title, the Levites and others. Because inevitably, if we would just be talking about the Levites, then while undoubtedly the story of the Levites has much to teach us in the Bible as well, you might argue that it's not all directly relevant, certainly to all of us. And as much as we will appreciate that even when the Bible teaches us history, it's not teaching us just history. It's not even teaching us in order to just teach us history. We're going to, of course, need to consider what the lessons of the Levites are to the Levites and others, like each one of us. But of course, inevitably, before we get there, we do need to consider the particular circumstances that the Bible has to convey to us with the Levites. And that inevitably brings us to, well, many passages, especially in the Torah, in the 5 books of Moses, and likely none with as great a degree of emphasis and as great a degree of detail as Numbers chapter 8. In verse 5, God spoke to Moses, saying, "Take the Levites from among the people of Israel and cleanse or purify them." And then there is, of course, the detailing of that process of purification. And in verse 10, "You shall present the Levites before God, and the people of Israel shall lay their hands upon the Levites," the laying on of hands being an act of empowerment, and Aaron shall offer the Levites before God as a wave offering from the people of Israel, also in essence to establish their status as the representatives of the nation by proxy. And by way of conclusion, skipping to verse 14, "Thus shall you separate the Levites from among the people of Israel, and the Levites shall be mine." What are the implications of this change in status? Well, the first emphasis that we find in Numbers chapter 8, and we're going to have to put this into a broader context as we consider the passages that still lie ahead, is the Levites go in to do the service of the tent of meeting. That is, they have a role in the tabernacle. And what God goes on to emphasize afterward, and this is in the following verses, in verses 16, 17, and 18, is the Levites have this role instead of the firstborn. That is, initially, the firstborn was intended, designated to serve in this role. And as we read in verse 16, they, the Levites, are wholly given unto me from among the people of Israel, instead of all who opens the womb, the firstborn of all the people of Israel. Instead of them, I have taken the Levites unto me. And God goes on to emphasize the special status of the firstborn as affirmed in Egypt in the 10th plague, the smiting of the firstborn. And by way of summation, I have taken the Levites instead of all the firstborn from among the people of Israel. Now this is a first and inevitably crucial point for us to appreciate. The difference between having a designated tribe, a caste of people that is consecrated in whole to this role, as opposed to the apparent initial plan, which was that this role was to be discharged by the firstborn in each family. It's instructive for us to consider the comparison. Obviously, if that plan would have been perpetuated, it would have meant that the extent to which each and every individual was connected to the temple service, to the priesthood, that extent would have been imminent to the ultimate degree. Every family would have had a representative working in the temple, the firstborn of the family. Obviously, on the one hand, there are a lot of advantages to that arrangement. It provides a far more intense sense of connectedness. Of course, it provides that far more intense sense of connectedness on the assumption that the firstborn is willing and capable of serving in that capacity. And of course, inevitably, that's the downside of that arrangement. Because if the firstborn is either unwilling or incapable of serving in that capacity, then you have a very serious problem. And while you could well argue that whether it's the firstborn or the Levites, it is, after all, people who are being designated for this role from birth. Maybe a better alternative would be to have a purely voluntary system. With respect to that alternative, a purely voluntary system, of course, there's an obvious downside, which is what happens if no one volunteers. But there's an additional dimension that I think inevitably we bear in mind here. And it also is a dimension that on a more subtle plane distinguishes the firstborns designated from birth from the Levites designated from birth. That additional dimension is, of course, when someone is consecrated to a certain role from birth. Inevitably, it becomes far more integrated in the very fabric of his being than if it is something for which that person volunteers at some later stage in life. So, of course, again, that's a consideration that militates in favor of having the people who are going to serve in this role be designated by birth. But I think it's also important for us to consider how it bears on the question of family firstborn versus Levites. Again, the family's firstborn would obviously be designated from birth. He was born first. He is the firstborn. And yet, while the firstborn would be designated from birth, he wouldn't be growing up in a cultural framework that is entirely directed toward this goal of dedicated service to God. Inevitably, the firstborn is growing up with his birth family. He has this unique role, but neither his parents, unless they are firstborns, nor his siblings have the same designation. Among the Levites, everyone has this designation. Growing up in an environment that is culturally permeated by this designation, this role of dedicated service. Again, obviously imposes a gap, a disparity between the Levites and the rest of the people that wouldn't exist if it were not a special tribe. But simultaneously, it provides a kind of insurance because it is, after all, that cultural background, that backdrop that underlies everything the Levites are doing, collectively and individually, from birth, that helps to ensure that this role that might otherwise be distributed to individuals in each and every family remains faithful to its source. Of course, inevitably, this also raises the question of why, when the original plan evidently called for the firstborns, the Levites were designated in their stead. And we will, of course, yet consider that pivotal event in another few minutes. In the interim, of course, one consideration that I feel compelled to emphasize is that while God in verse 17 speaks of his specially designating the firstborn on the day that I smote all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, of course, on some plane, we recognize that the very fact that the plague was directed against the firstborn is because the firstborn natively represents that special role. And of course, in Genesis, we discussed the extent to which the tension over who is the firstborn, who is the one designated by God, is such a dominant theme in Genesis. It is, after all, ultimately, when the Levites are designated as that special class of people, that when all is said and done, the firstborn, at least in this role, becomes far less consequential. What is of greatest consequence is, again, coming from this tribe, from the Levites, from that cultural background that designates the Levites different. And of course, inevitably then, if we are going to understand what the Levites represent, we need to explore what that cultural background is. And in order to do so, first place to look is in the biography of the progenitor of the tribe, the biography of Levi. Unfortunately, however, the event that seems to better define the identity of Levi than any other that we read in Genesis chapter 34 is not in any way a pleasant one, or even, it would seem, a positive one. First of all, the circumstances of the event are absolutely horrible. The circumstance is the rape of Jacob and Leah's daughter Dinah. And as you may recall, in Genesis chapter 34, the rapist, Shechem, son of Hamor, comes to sue for Dinah's hand in marriage, whereupon Jacob's sons stipulate a condition. The condition is that he and all of his townsfolk need to become circumcised. Now, the apparent agenda of Jacob's sons in stipulating this condition was they're not going to go through with this, and since they won't go through with it, we'll have a good excuse to take our sister back and explain very politely that we just can't marry her off to one of these people who isn't circumcised. Unfortunately for them, the plan seems to have backfired because Shechem and all of his townsfolk immediately agree to undergo circumcision. Whereupon, in verse 25, we read about what evidently, perhaps spontaneously on the fly, was advanced by two of the brothers, Shimon and Levi, as plan B. On the third day, when they, the townsfolk of Shechem, after having undergone the circumcision, were in pain, two of the sons of Jacob, Shimon and Levi, Dinah's brothers, took each man his sword and came upon the city unawares and slew all the males. And they slew Hamor and Shechem his son with the edge of the sword and took Dinah out of Shechem's house and went forth. The sons of Jacob came upon the slain and spoiled the city. Now, our translation reads here, because they had defiled their sister. A more precise rendering of the Hebrew would be the city that had defiled their sister. And I'm not quibbling on a detail of the presentation of the subordinate clause. I think there's a crucial difference between because and that. That is to say that the sons of Jacob came upon the slain and spoiled the city because they had defiled their sister, is simply giving us the justification of the sons of Jacob for doing the act. But again, a more precise reading of the Hebrew, Asher tima'u achotam, would give us the city that had defiled their sister. The difference is, then, Scripture is not informing us of the motivation or justification of Jacob's sons. Scripture is inserting this seemingly extraneous description of the city, as if to say, the city. And remember, that's the city that defiled their sister. It's not the sons of Jacob giving it justification of the act here. It is, in fact, Scripture giving us a justification of the act. That this city had it coming to it because they had, either by sin of commission, in the case of Shechem, or sin of omission, everyone else who didn't prevent him from doing it, defiled Dinah. So they kill off the whole city. Again, Scripture seems to hint at the very least, a justification in retrospect for the act. It certainly doesn't indicate that it was the appropriate course that should have been followed, all things being equal. But in verse 30, Jacob has a different issue. An issue undoubtedly related, but one that we should consider in its context here as well. And Jacob said to Shimon and Levi, "You have troubled me. You have agitated me, to make me odious unto the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites and the Perizzites, and I, being few in number, they will gather themselves together against me and smite me, and I shall be destroyed, I and my house." In other words, note that Jacob is not addressing the question of the moral culpability of Shechem and his townsfolk, nor is he even addressing the question of the moral justification of Shimon and Levi killing all of the townsfolk. Rather, what is he essentially telling them? He's telling them, you acted in a headstrong, impulsive manner that is simply stupid, because the danger to which you have subjected all of us, and let's face it, not just all of us physically, but the danger to which you have subjected the spiritual mission of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that at this point depends upon Jacob and his family surviving. All that you've jeopardized. You're acting impulsively. You're not thinking. You're not thinking about the consequences. And ironically, what their answer tells us is, he's right. They're not. They're not thinking about the consequences. And they said, should one deal with our sister as with a harlot? And of course, again, I reiterate, what that answer says is, we didn't understand the question. Because they are acting impulsively. Their righteous indignation over the crime perpetrated by Shechem with the apparent complicity of his townsfolk is all that matters to them. And that they're acting impulsively, that they're acting irresponsibly, isn't even entering into their equation. We fast forward to the end of Jacob's life, when in Genesis chapter 49, Jacob calls his sons, "Gather yourselves together that I may tell you that which shall befall you in the end of days." And he dispenses his blessings to his sons, or at least we should say to most of his sons. As for Shimon and Levi, it's not by any means a blessing. Shimon and Levi are brethren. Instruments of violence are their wares. Let my soul not come into their counsel, and unto their assembly let not my glory be united. For in their anger they slew men, and in their self-will they hewed or maimed oxen. And therefore, what's the conclusion that this dictates? Well, again, Shimon and Levi are dangerous. They resort to instruments of violence, and they behave in a dangerously impulsive manner. And therefore, cursed be their anger, for it was fierce, and their wrath, for it was cruel, or more precisely, it was harsh in the Hebrew. I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel. Now let's consider what Jacob is stating here. Better yet, let's emphasize what he is not stating here. I hope this is clear to us all. He is not cursing Shimon and Levi. I'm not quibbling over semantics here, noting what he's cursing is their anger and their wrath, and not them. I'm observing this not only because that's what he says. He says, cursed be their anger, but also because of his solution to that problem of their anger. If he were cursing them, he would, instead of stating, I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel, state, let them be destroyed. Well, God forbid, he is not praying for their destruction. He is praying for their being scattered in Israel. Why? Why scatter them? If you'll allow me to use a simple-minded analogy. Salt is something that we often sprinkle on food to bring out the flavor. When we scatter it on the food, sprinkle it loosely, then indeed it can often enhance the taste. But if we take a big load of salt and dump it in just one place, all it does is it makes the food inedible. And that's beside the fact that it raises our blood pressure. So the analogy here, of course, is intended to appreciate why Jacob dictates that Shimon and Levi need to be scattered in Israel. That is, their anger is something that, if concentrated in one place, if Shimon and Levi are too much united and together, they're dangerous. They're destructive. They act impulsively, and by consequence, they can endanger themselves and endanger everyone else. But the attribute that they signify still has merit. Just the merit needs to be integrated into a greater organic whole that can accommodate it appropriately. So therefore, curse the anger and scatter them in Israel. Don't curse them. Scatter them. Scatter them so their anger, instead of going off explosively in one place, will be able to exercise the positive effect that it should. Inevitably, you may be wondering, what is this positive effect? Well, of course, on the one hand, we readily appreciate the positive effect is that righteous indignation in the first place. You may recall we spoke about this some months ago at the beginning of Exodus when we discussed the biography of Moses. That Moses, in his early years, is displayed in Scripture as simply incapable of remaining indifferent when he sees an injustice being perpetrated. So when he sees the Egyptian wrongfully smiting one of the Hebrews, and he looks around and doesn't see anyone else who's standing up to do anything about it, he kills him. And when the next day he sees two Hebrews fighting with one another and one getting ready to smite the other, even though he realizes he got into enough trouble the previous day, he can't keep quiet. And he has to intervene. And because of that intervention, the news of what he had done to the Egyptian reaches Pharaoh's ears, who tries to kill him, and he has to run for his life. And remember what happens? He runs for his life to Midian. And sitting by the well as a vagabond and stranger, he sees the men shepherds roughing up the women shepherdesses, and there he is, completely new location. He knows full well that sticking his nose in other incidents has only gotten him in trouble, and he can't help himself. He has to get up, fight with all the shepherds in order to rescue the shepherdesses. Righteous indignation. Righteous indignation is an asset. What it means, you can't abide by injustices being committed. Or, to express it in even more basic terms, you can't be indifferent. And I think this is particularly instructive when one considers what happens with the dialogue between God and Moses at the burning bush in Exodus chapter 4. Specifically, in verse 13, Moses, who all along has been trying his hardest to get out of doing this mission, finally says, "O Lord, send, I pray you, by the hand of him whom you will send." Now, what is this supposed to mean? Our traditional interpretation of Moses' request here is, you have in the past communed through prophecy to Aaron. This we know, of course, from the beginning of the book of Samuel, where Eli, the priest, is told by the rebuking messenger of God, I revealed myself to your father's house in Egypt. By our tradition, that was to Aaron, Eli's direct ancestor. So Moses is saying, you've communed with Aaron before, go to him. Leave me out of it. Deal with him. And the anger of God was kindled against Moses, and he said, is there not Aaron, your brother, the Levite? I know that he can speak well. Now let's consider what's going on over here. God specifically identifies Aaron as the Levite. Now, of course, Aaron is a Levite, but of course, by the same token, Moses knows that very well. Moses is also a Levite. They are, after all, brothers. It is, on the face of it, completely superfluous for God to include this special identification of Aaron as a Levite. Except, evidently, it's not superfluous. If it were superfluous, God wouldn't have said it. But I think we can discern in identifying Aaron as the Levite part of God's rebuke of Moses and part of his response. That is, recalling the character of the Levites as derived from, if you will, the cultural milieu of Levi and family. Levi was impulsive because he couldn't be indifferent. He had to act proactively. Well, Aaron is a Levite, and he will be proactive. He's not going to just sit around and do nothing. I know that he can speak well. That anger that had been manifest in Shimon and Levi will be manifest in Aaron in taking an active role. The thinly veiled criticism of Moses is maybe you should be more of a Levite yourself. Instead of looking for excuses to not take the mission with which I am charging you. Aaron, in any case, is a Levite, and he will be your spokesman unto the people. People who have a tendency to shy away from challenge, not Aaron. Aaron is a Levite. Levites don't shy away. Levites are not indifferent. Levites don't sit back and say, maybe you could find someone else to do this. Aaron, as the Levite, will personify the diligence, the conscientiousness, the dedication, the concern. And he will speak. He will not remain silent. This is the identity that he inherits from the tribe of Levi. And when we consider the significance of this tribal identification, the next place that it appears in Scripture, we can surmise that Moses got the message. This is, of course, the tragic event that I intimated earlier when we spoke of just what the circumstance had been that dictated the Levites coming instead of the firstborn. The event, the sin of the golden calf. Moses turned and went down from the mount with the two tablets of the testimony in his hand, tablets that were written on both their sides. And when he came near the camp and saw the calf and the dancing, Moses' anger waxed hot, and he cast the tablets out of his hands and broke them beneath the mount. Moses is also a Levite here. He is not indifferent. And he took the calf which they had made and burnt it with fire and ground it to a powder and strewed it upon the water and made the people of Israel drink of it. And then in verse 26, Moses stood in the gate of the camp and said, "Whoso is on God's side, let him come to me." And all the sons of Levi gathered themselves together to him. And Moses says to them, "Thus says the Lord God of Israel, put you every man his sword upon his thigh, and go to and fro from gate to gate throughout the camp, and slay every man his brother, and every man his companion, and every man his neighbor." And the sons of Levi did according to the word of Moses, and there fell of the people that day about 3,000 men. Well, on the face of it, when you read this at first brush, sounds like Levi all over again. Impulsive action. Righteous indignation and being carried away with it. But wait, that's not happening here. First of all, if, as indicated, all the sons of Levi were participating in this operation, if it were really a killing spree, would only about 3,000 men fall? We're talking about a whole tribe here. Surely they could have exercised far more damage than that. Yeah, but they're not doing this to be impulsive. They are doing it to obey divine orders. Thus says God. This is the divine mission. Those who have committed the sin of idolatry need to be punished. And indeed, in our tradition, the role of this going to and fro from gate to gate throughout the camp was to establish tribunals to judge the guilty parties and execute them, which is why only 3,000 died. There weren't that many people who were guilty, at least guilty of actually engaging in a capital crime with respect to the golden calf. So it's not a matter of impulsivity. It is rather a matter of caring. And indeed, the conclusion, Moses said, consecrate yourselves today to God. For every man has been against his son and against his brother, that he may also bestow upon you a blessing this day. Now let's consider what this means. Consecrate yourselves today to God. That's indeed henceforth going to be the role of Levi. Dedicated to God. Dedicated to God because you conscientiously overcame the impulsive feelings of love towards son and brother. You did what needed to be done because you cared, because you weren't indifferent. This is indeed the charge of Levi. And the firstborn didn't measure up. They participated in whatever took place with the golden calf, and they were not the ones who gathered themselves to Moses when he called, whoso is on God's side, let him come unto me. And therefore, Levi is specifically the one who is then designated. Now, the first place that we read about the designation of Levi is in Numbers chapter 1. We discussed the earlier portion of Numbers chapter 1 last time. After we read about the census, the count of the entire nation, these are those that were numbered, which Moses and Aaron numbered. But the Levites, they were not numbered among them. They have a different designation. And in verse 48, God spoke unto Moses, saying, howbeit the tribe of Levi you shall not number, neither shall you take the sum of them among the people of Israel, but rather appoint you the Levites over the tabernacle of the testimony, and over all the furniture, the vessels thereof, and over all that belongs to it. They shall bear the tabernacle and all the furniture thereof, and they shall minister unto it, and shall encamp round about the tabernacle. And when the tabernacle sets forward, that is, when you move from one station in the wilderness to another, the Levites take it down, and when the tabernacle is to be pitched, the Levites set it up, and the common man that draws near shall be put to death. Now this is very instructive. We should consider what in fact this is telling us regarding the role of the Levites, and in particular, their role with respect to nation. Why would any common man, that is, someone who is not designated to work with the tabernacle or in taking it down or setting it up, in other words, who is not a Levite, why would he come near? Especially when doing so results in death. This is death in the hand of heaven. But nonetheless, it is in some sense a capital crime. Why would someone do this? The ready answer: people don't always think. They act impulsively. And with the intensity of one's love of God, we talked about this a little bit in a different context regarding the sons of Aaron some weeks back. With the intensity of that love, one may lose one's bearings and overstep one's bounds. Consider that it is specifically the Levites who are charged here. So there be no wrath upon the congregation of the people of Israel. The Levites are pitched around the tabernacle. The Levites shall keep the charge of the tabernacle of the testimony. Keeping the charge in the Hebrew, the Shemru Mishmeret, watching, safeguarding, maintaining the boundaries. Remember, in the case of the progenitor of the tribe, Levi, we first encounter him acting impulsively. Here, the Levites aren't the impulsive ones altogether. On the contrary, they're supposed to rein in possible impulsive behavior by other people. Very interesting, isn't it? Of course, on the one hand, when I was thinking of this model, that the Levites, who maybe have something of an inherent tendency toward impulsive behavior, are the ones to control impulsive behavior in other people, I thought of the model used in organizations such as Alcoholics Anonymous. For those who aren't familiar, Alcoholics Anonymous is an organization that has been operating for a great many years in the United States and has spread to many other countries as well, to help people who have succumbed to an addiction to drinking, to alcohol. And a key component of their success is that all the people who are providing guidance in order to help alcoholics recover are themselves recovering alcoholics. People who once were addicted to alcohol themselves. And it is specifically because they know what it's like that they can guide their companions who are still fighting an addiction to safe harbor. So, in a way, same idea. The Levites, who perhaps innately really do have a tendency toward impulsive behavior, are therefore the ones who, having learned to control that impulsivity, are going to guide others to overcome their tendency toward impulsive behavior. Consider altogether the sin of the golden calf. What was it, if not the epitome of impulsive behavior? That was the problem. The solution is not to become impulsive. The solution is to be straightforward, considered, but not indifferent, to care. And so it is the Levites then who were cast in that leadership role after the sin of the golden calf, who here are charged with weaning anyone else who might still be tending toward dangerously impulsive behavior away from that behavior. That inevitably is one important aspect of what's taking place here. But I think there's an additional dimension that we should also be considering. And it also inevitably goes back to the roots of the tribe in the person of Levi. And I think this communicates to each and every one of us a crucially important lesson as well. Levi, as we encounter him, again in Genesis chapter 34, was not doing well. He was not doing right. Admittedly, given the answer that he and Shimon provide to Jacob's challenge, Jacob's rebuke, doesn't even appear that they understood that what they were doing was not right and not appropriate. Okay, but we do. And to drive this point closer to home, let's consider when a person, read each and every one of us, discerns in oneself, in ourselves, some type of behavior, some modality, what appears as a character trait that isn't good, that results in destructive behavior, destructive toward others, or destructive toward oneself. How are we to relate to that part of ourselves? Some people might say, well, you just have to engage in some act of self-amputation and cut that out. But I think that's missing the point. Rather, we need to appreciate that when we're behaving in a dysfunctional manner, it's not because the essential endowment that is part of our natures is dysfunctional, because that essential endowment is there because God gave it to us. If anything, on the contrary, it is crucially important if we are to fulfill our mission in life. Only thing is, it is expressing itself in a bad way, which is why we need to reform it, to redress it, to redirect it. We need to appreciate that the problem doesn't lie with the essential nature. The problem lies with the way it's being expressed. So, returning to Levi, the essential nature was caring, being concerned, not being indifferent. Unfortunately, the way that expressed itself was in dangerously impulsive behavior. His tribe is still endowed in its cultural setting with the same essential attribute. But again, the essential attribute is not impulsivity. That's an expression. That expression they need to overcome. The essential attribute is being concerned. It's caring. which is precisely what endows them with the wherewithal to care about making sure that other people aren't going to behave in a destructively impulsive manner. So, again, they keep the charge. And this theme becomes a recurrent one in Numbers chapter 3. Again, bring the tribe of Levi near, they shall keep his charge, the charge of the whole congregation, keep all the furniture, the vessels of the tent of meeting, the charge of the people of Israel. All of these in the Hebrew are the same root. V'shameru, mishmeret, watching, being concerned, safeguarding. And thus, then, compensating for what was on one hand the negative expression in the tribe, the impulsivity, and on the other hand, the inappropriate impulsivity of the firstborns who got it wrong. And so again, God says, I have taken the Levites instead of the firstborn. And it is again to do the service of the tabernacle of God. The theme of doing the service of the tent of meeting is indeed a recurrent one. Again, in Numbers chapter 18, here there's an additional context, which is because that's what they are doing, they will be completely dedicated to the service of God. They're not going to be going out to pursue some other type of career. And so, in Numbers chapter 18, God tells them through Aaron, you shall have no inheritance in the land, neither shall you have any portion among them, among the other tribes. I am your portion and your inheritance among the people of Israel. And what that means in practice is, I have given all the tithe in Israel for an inheritance to the tribe of Levi, in return for the service that they serve, the service of the tent of meeting. To what end? They protect the people of Israel, to not come too close. The Levites who care alone shall do the service of the tent of meeting. And again, the recompense is the tithe. In Deuteronomy chapter 10, we read, by way of summation, at that time, God separated the tribe of Levi to bear the ark of the covenant of God, to stand before God to minister unto him, and to bless in his name unto this day. And therefore, again, no portion or inheritance with the other tribes. God is his inheritance. This theme of serving in the tabernacle, by consequence of which you receive the tithe, then, of course, emphasizes the special role of Levi at the heart, the sanctuary, the tabernacle. But, there's an additional dimension, and this additional dimension is expressed in Deuteronomy chapter 18, for one, where on the one hand, we read again about eating the offerings of God, his inheritance, that God is their inheritance. And then we read that if a Levite, in verse 6, comes from any of your gates out of all of Israel where he sojourns, and comes with all the desire of his soul to the place that God shall choose, he shall minister in the name of God, his Lord, as all of his brethren, the Levites, do, and they shall have like portions to eat, and so on. But of course, inevitably, a question that we need to address is, why was the Levite in the first place in all these various gates of all of Israel, the city gates where he sojourned? Why wasn't he exclusively in the place that God chooses from the start? The theme of the Levite being within your gates is very much a recurrent one in Deuteronomy. In Deuteronomy chapter 12, the Levite that is within your gates in verse 12, and again in verse 18. And of course, the implication that you need to provide for the Levite that is within your gates. In chapter 14, likewise, the Levite that is within your gates in verse 27, verse 29, again, the Levite that is within your gates, and again in the context of ensuring that you provide for his physical needs, his physical sustenance. This is again a recurrent theme. I'm not elaborating upon the various sources, but providing for the Levite that is within your gates in chapter 16, verse 11, and in verse 14, and again in chapter 26, providing for the Levite in your midst in verse 11, verse 12, the Levite within your gates, and so on and so forth. You get the idea. Why is the Levite within your gates? Why isn't he in the temple? But then, of course, inevitably, we remember. We remember that this, after all, inevitably goes back to the words of Father Jacob. I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel. Because since the essential character trait is redeemable, it is indeed redeemed. It's caring. But the expression being impulsive and headstrong is bad. We need to cast them in the most crucial role in the nation that hinges upon being in the gates with the people, to be the teachers. Indeed, even more explicitly in Deuteronomy chapter 31, after the Torah is complete, Moses commands the Levites bearing the Ark of the Covenant, take this book of the law, the Torah, and put it by the side of the Ark of the Covenant of God your Lord. This isn't merely because the Levites are the ones who bear the Ark. Inevitably, of course, we recognize this is the role of the Levites. To be the teachers, to be the guides, in the gates, everyone. Because if there is one career in life, more than anything else, that is predicated upon not being indifferent, that is predicated upon caring, on being concerned, it's teaching. It's teaching God's Word. And indeed, 2 chapters later, in Moses' final blessing to the tribes, to Levi, he said, on the one hand, your Tumim and Urim be with your Holy One, referring to the leaders of Levi, indeed, referring to Aaron, and referring also to himself, and then referring to what happened at the golden calf. Who said of his father and of his mother, I have not seen him, neither did he acknowledge his brethren, nor knew his own children, for they have observed your word and keep your covenant. It's not impulsive. It's again, keeping. Shamiru in the Hebrew, safeguarding. And therefore, because they care, they shall teach Jacob your ordinances, and Israel your law. That is their mission. That's their identity. Indeed, to be the teachers. And when we spoke earlier of being of God's portion, God's inheritance, in practice, the tithes that sustain them, the tithes aren't intended really to sustain them so that they can work in the temple. In Chronicles 2, chapter 31, skipping a few centuries into the future, we read of the righteous king Hezekiah, that he establishes the institutionalized structure of the service in the temple. Moreover, chapter 31, verse 4, he commanded the people that dwelt in Jerusalem to give the portion of the priests and the Levites, that they might give themselves, or be strengthened in the Torah of God. That is, note how the emphasis begins with the tabernacle. And of course, we're not in any way reducing the significance of the service in the tabernacle and later in the Holy Temple by the Levites. But ultimately, what's the goal? What's the essence? The essence is, they shall teach Jacob your ordinances and Israel your Torah. They themselves receive the portion designated of the produce, that they might strengthen themselves and thus strengthen the nation in the Torah of God. They are the teachers. They personify dedication to God's message. And therefore, of course, not only do they receive God's portion, the components of the produce that are designated for them, they themselves become God's portion. Perhaps nowhere is this role of the Levites more dramatically expressed than in Nehemiah chapter 8. In verse 2, we read of Ezra bringing the Torah before the congregation, both men and women, and all that could hear with understanding upon the first day of the 7th month. We referred to this event a long time ago when we spoke of the Jewish New Year, because, of course, the designation, first day of the 7th month, means this is what's taking place on the date designated as the Jewish New Year, the first day of the month of Tishrei, the 7th month. So Ezra is bringing the Torah before the congregation, and we read in verse 7 that all of the various leaders and the Levites caused the people to understand the Torah. And they read it in the book of God distinctly, the Torah of God distinctly, and they gave the sense and caused them to understand the reading. And in helping them to understand what the Torah is teaching them, what the teachers unwittingly engendered was an extraordinary emotional outburst. All the people began to cry. And Nehemiah and Ezra and the Levites that taught the people, note the way they described, said unto all the people, this day is holy unto God your Lord, mourn not nor weep. For all the people wept when they heard the words of the Torah. And in verse 11, likewise, the Levites stilled all the people. Shh, calm down. Hold your peace, for the day is holy. Neither be ye grieved. In other words, again, don't be impulsive. Calm down. And most of all, learn from the Levites. They care. This is such a dramatic description of the loving teacher being concerned for his students, for his flock. This is the Levites fully actualized. That potential that was manifest latently in the impulsivity of Levi. Here we see in its complete fruition in being someone who really cares. So, of course, inevitably, to that extent, when we consider what this tells us of the Levites, it does, of course, communicate something crucially important to each of us. It teaches us about harnessing the faculties, the nature with which we are endowed, to discern, even in that which seems to express itself negatively, the key to our ultimately being able to fulfill our mission with God in this world. Of course, most specifically, it teaches us about being concerned, about caring, about being the loving teacher, and about being dedicated to God. But of course, so far we've been speaking about being dedicated to God by birth. Not incidentally, the title this evening was Numbers 8 and 9, dedicated to God by birth or by choice. And in our last few minutes, I'd like to turn to Numbers chapter 9 and consider what this adds to all of the foregoing, specifically by our considering what's taking place in Numbers chapter 9, seemingly completely unrelated to what we saw about the Levites in chapter 8. But I think there's an important message to be gleaned from the juxtaposition coming together. In Numbers chapter 9, we read of the celebration of the Passover offering in the second year of the Exodus. God commands this observance, let the people of Israel keep the Passover offering in its appointed season. And in verse 5, they did so. They kept the Passover offering in the first month, the 14th day of the month, at dusk. One thing is, there was a problem. The problem was, as we read in verse 6, there were certain men who were defiled by the dead body of a man, so they could not keep the Passover offering, because in a state of defilement, they are, of course, prohibited from coming into contact with the consecrated offering or any of the precincts of the tabernacle. And they came before Moses and before Aaron on that day. And they said, we are defiled by the dead body of a man, wherefore are we to be kept back so as to not bring the offering of God in his appointed season among the people of Israel? They're complaining. We want to be able to bring the Passover offering. Now, we should note at the outset, on a purely formal plane, what they are presenting here is a groundless, even absurd argument. You're in a state of defilement. You can't bring the offering. Okay, we have a general principle that pertains to all of Torah law. If you can't do something under duress because of circumstances beyond your control, fine, you're exempt. No one's going to hold it against you. But don't ask to do what you can't do. You're in a state of defilement. You're not eligible. An absurd protest, we would think, except Moses responds, stay you that I may hear what God will command concerning you, and God's command is, we'll give him a second chance. speak to the people of Israel, saying, if any man of you or your generations is defiled by reason of a dead body, or in a journey far off, he shall keep the Passover offering unto God in the second month, instead of in the first month. Extraordinary. When you're really dedicated to God, you get a second chance. What might have struck us as a completely inappropriate query elicits a new dimension of the Torah. And we should stress how extraordinarily revolutionary this is. That is, we have a general principle, as expressed in Deuteronomy chapter 33 as well. Moses commanded us a law, the Torah, an inheritance of the congregation of Jacob. All of the commandments of the Torah are given to us through Moses, except in a way, this one. The observance of the second Passover for those who missed out the first opportunity because they were in a state of defilement or whatever. That commandment comes to us by courtesy of these people. By courtesy of these people who feel insistent upon, despite the fact that God didn't call them, they came. They came before Moses and before Aaron. They don't want to be kept back. They take the initiative. And that makes all the difference. It's not just a matter of circumstances of birth, circumstances of choice. And indeed, in Psalm 16, King David writes, O Lord, my allotted portion and my cup, you maintain my lot. Allotted portion is what we saw regarding the Levites. Yes, but you can decide to make God your portion. I have a beautiful, pleasing heritage. You make God your heritage. How? In verse 8, I have set God always before me. Surely he is at my right hand. I shall not be moved. This is, of course, a recurrent theme in Psalms. God knows the days of them that are wholehearted, and their inheritance shall be forever, because their inheritance is God. In Psalm 73, Song of Asaph, my flesh and my heart fails, but God is the rock of my heart and my portion. Not Levites. That everyone who reads these words and integrates them can say, God is my portion forever. How? Well, in verse 28. When you come to the realization that nearness of God is my good. It's my definition of good. That's what I call good. I dedicate myself to God because I care. Not by birth, but by choice. Likewise, Psalm 119, my portion is God. Note that, again, there is the observance, safeguarding. I said that I would observe your words in the Hebrew lishmov, same root as safeguarding. Safeguarding, but that's the safeguarding that I'm integrating. It's not because of a birthright. It's because of my dedication. And, of course, similarly, I don't want to over-belabor this point, Psalm 142, again, I have said, you are my refuge, my portion in the land of the living. we make God our portion when we so choose. Also Lamentations. There, in the sobering circumstance of national destruction, still and all, the Lord is my portion, said my soul. Therefore will I hope in him. It's up to us. It's not just a matter of birth, it's a matter of choice. We can choose. We have the opportunity. And because of that, while in a general sense, we certainly have the wherewithal to learn the lesson of the Levites, in this specific sense, we learn still more. We learn how we too can fill that role. Who's we? We is all of us. And on that note, we conclude with Isaiah chapter 66, where the prophet, envisioning the end days, says in the name of God, I know their works and their thoughts. The time comes that I will gather all nations and tongues, and they shall come and shall see my glory. And they will bring all your brethren out of all the nations for an offering unto God upon horses and chariots, litters, mules, joyous songs, to my holy mountain Jerusalem, says God. And of them also will I take for the priests and for the Levites, says God. Of them also, of them who are being brought, and of them who are bringing. Because what the Levites signify is again taking that latent, underlying attribute that initially was expressed not desirously. Initially was expressed as impulsivity. Taking that character trait and bringing it to its full fruition. Dedication to God. Being concerned. Caring. Loving. May we too integrate that attribute. Learn that lesson. Appreciate that message. May we too seek within ourselves the underlying attribute that needs to be redeemed and that we can redeem. And may we too then dedicate it to God and to His service. Because it's not just about the Levites. It really is about each and every one of us making God our portion and our inheritance. And reciprocally, making ourselves, as it were, part of God's portion. May we indeed rise to this challenge. Earn the blessings. God bless you.